Good afternoon. Natalie, David, friends, thank you all for coming. I want to start off by saying this to Robin. All of us gathered here share your shocking loss and deep pain, especially those of us from the Star family. This event is really designed as a tribute to an institution that your father sustained in very tough times and finally ensured its continuity. That your grandfather strengthened what Joseph Atkinson had built. An institution that tries mightily to articulate, I think, basically what makes Canada, Canada. A nation built by Ukrainians and people from all over the world, which is quite unique in its multiculturalism and the way it operates on the world stage. We have a very distinguished panel here today. Carol Goar has been the Star's national affairs columnist in Ottawa, correspondent in Washington, editorial page editor, and general columnist. Bob Hepburn has been the Star's Ottawa bureau chief, correspondent in Washington, correspondent in Jerusalem, national editor, foreign editor, editorial page editor, and since 2008, a political columnist. Ian Urquhart, who has been a boss for many of us, has been the Ottawa bureau chief, national editor, editorial page editor, managing editor, and Queen's Park columnist. I will start with a brief intro, because Carol has asked me to do so, about the Star's pioneering role in Canada. And then Carol will outline the legacy of the Atkinson Foundation and the principles that continue to guide the paper up to this day. Ian will take us through the 1980s, the very intense debates that we have had on free trade and the Constitution, which he was witness to and, in fact, helped shape public opinion on those subjects. Bob then will cover the 1990s, starting with the role in the amalgamation of Toronto's 6 municipalities, which was not very popular at that time. And I know a critic is sitting right here. As most of you know, the Star was a product, an accident of history, because it was born of a labor dispute. In 1892, it was started by 21 printers and 4 teenage apprentices who had been locked out of the afternoon daily that was then called the News. Their 4-page newspaper was called the Evening Star, and they branded themselves as a paper for the people. It was actually the 7th daily newspaper in the city of 180,000 people at that time. It had initial struggles, but then it's prospered under its new editor, 34-year-old Joseph Atkinson, who had been hired from the Globe. Atkinson had had a very impoverished childhood, and he felt viscerally about the need for economic and social justice in Canada. He thus became a pioneer in advocating for labor unions, for the right of workers, for a minimum wage, for worker compensation, for unemployment insurance, for disability benefits, and retirement pensions, reforms that very few people had known about or thought about at that time. And being a devout Methodist, he was also running crusades against gambling and alcohol, refusing to run beer ads and liquor ads, a policy that could not be overturned until 1968. Very relevant to today, he was wary of the United States and its attitude towards Canada. Quote, "The United States is led by its evil genius to embark on an era of conquest and aggression that should concern Canada." In 1911, he opposed free trade with the United States that was proposed by Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier even though Laurier himself had hired Joseph Atkinson at the Star in 1899. Atkinson was well ahead of his time on many issues, challenging, for example, racial and religious bigotry. Quote, "Men who rob and maltreat Chinese laundrymen deserve severe punishment. The Chinese people are entitled to the fullest protection of the law," unquote, 1906. He was also arguing at that time for religious accommodation for the Jewish community by easing the Sunday observation laws. Quote, "When a man, in accordance with his religious faith, refrains from work on one day of the week, it is unquestionable hardship to force him to remain idle on some other day," unquote. In 1912, for example, he was challenging the very populist denigration of immigrants, which still goes on up to this day. Quote, "People of all races are coming here and should have a fair chance to develop the best in them," unquote. In 1918, he enraged the Orange Order by condemning anti-Catholicism. Quote, "Charges against the Roman Catholics are greedily devoured by the public and accepted without inquiry by too many people," unquote. During the Depression, he was horrified about what he called the orgy of deportation of immigrants and refugees. Quote again, "No man should be at risk of being banished from Canada by the police or by the authorities without a right to appeal to the courts." He's saying this in the 1930s. After the Second World War, he began advocating for daycare. We are still talking about the topic until today. Quote, "Is it or is it not desirable that people should be able to give their children a proper start in life?" Unquote. In 1944, John Honderich joined the paper. He too had come from a very poor background, and he identified with the downtrodden and with Atkinson's campaign for socio-economic justice. Mr. Atkinson died in 1948, and to ensure that his principles and his ideals were continued by the paper, he bequeathed his shares to the Atkinson Charitable Foundation, of which Carol has been a director. I'll now ask Carol to come and pick up the story. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your warm welcome. I'll try to pick up where Haroon left off. Today, the Atkinson Foundation has a strictly arm's-length relationship with the Toronto Star. It is a charity that uses the yearly earnings of Joseph Atkinson's endowment to make grants to individuals, organizations, and movements working for social justice. That is not what Mr. Atkinson intended. He created the foundation to own and operate the Toronto Star. But the Ontario government soon scuttled that. In 1949, it legislated the Charitable Gifts Act, stipulating that a charity could own no more than 10% of a business. Initially, the newspaper's ideology was so well understood by its editors and writers that it didn't need to be written down or codified. It wasn't until the late 1970s that John Honderich, the president and publisher of the Toronto Star, attempted to summarize what came to be known as the Atkinson Principles. There are 6. The Toronto Star stands for a strong, united Canada. The Star believes the state has a right and duty to act when the private sector cannot or will not. The Star defends the rights of working people. It maintains that every person should have sustenance. That includes individuals who are out of work, the elderly, children, the poor, and those in ill health. The newspaper advocates that cities, Toronto in particular, rise above the interests of particular factions, groups, or property owners to provide all citizens with parks, pleasant boulevards, public beaches, and attractive architecture. Finally, the Star holds that everyone is entitled to freedom of belief, expression, and equality before the law. These principles have been interpreted, misinterpreted, stretched, and twisted in so many different ways over the years, it's little wonder that myths and exaggerations have arisen. Let me tackle a few of them. Number one, it is not true that Toronto Star employees slavishly adhere to the Atkinson principles. Most journalists working for the Star don't have a clue what they are, where they came from, or why they matter. When I was hired, for instance, I knew the Star had confident, stylish writers, demanding editors, and a Toronto-centric view. That made it a fine platform for the issues that I wanted to write about. The face of poverty, the importance of affordable housing, the neglect of mental illness, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a privileged few. I had no idea for half the years I spent at the Star that the Atkinson principles even existed. Myth number two, it is not true that the Star is a liberal house organ. It does have a center-left outlook, and it is accurate to say the Star has editorially endorsed the Liberal Party in all but one federal election. But having participated in many of the editorial meetings where that decision was made, I can tell you there was nothing automatic or foreordained about it. It was often the least bad of the available options. Every Toronto Star editorialist with whom I worked cursed the tradition of editorial endorsements and winced when they were published. Myth number three, it's not true that Toronto Star writers are expected to apply a set of moral precepts developed in the 40s and 50s to every current issue. The idea is ludicrous. The Atkinson principles say nothing about feminism, globalization, genetic engineering, LGBT issues, opioid addiction, or terrorism, to name a few. Each generation has to tackle its own challenges. I'll give you a small illustration. I was the Star's national affairs columnist in Ottawa when the National Action Committee on the Status of Women organized a massive lobbying campaign to put pressure on the government to add a section to the Constitution guaranteeing all rights equally to women and men. I understood the women's desire for enforceable legislation. I shared many of their concerns, and I respected the leaders of the movement. But I balked at their assumption that as a woman, I would be on their side, champion their cause, and throw the full weight of the Toronto Star behind their campaign. I was a journalist. I wasn't on anybody's side. I weighed their demands against what I knew. These were white, educated, middle-class women who already had, and I quote, equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. Should sex be singled out for special attention when so many people were struggling to feed their families, pay their rent, get a job, or resist racial stereotyping? Should my gender or my conscience determine my priorities? I can tell you I would have welcomed a handy set of principles to guide me. Myth number 4, it is laughably untrue that employees of the Toronto Star regard Joseph Atkinson and his heirs with great reverence. He was known as Holy Joe in our newsroom. Every month, the staff gathered to recognize the best reported or best written story in the paper. The winner got a jokingly named Holy Joe mug and 1 Torch Star share. All joking aside, though, the Atkinson principles do continue to influence the kind of stories the Star highlights, the kind of crusades it undertakes, and its editorial stance on everything from Canada-US relations to urban development. Ian and Bob will talk more about that. So I'll turn briefly to another aspect of Joseph Atkinson's legacy, his charitable pursuits. To him, it was the right and proper role of a metropolitan newspaper to put its words into action. Reporting hardship without doing anything about it would have been a moral failing. 2 charities sprang from that conviction. The first was the Fresh Air Fund, launched in 1901. It appeals to readers to give children stuck in the hot city a shady vacation. Last year, the Fresh Air Fund sent more than 25,000 kids to day camps across the Greater Toronto region. Some of its most generous donors, proportional to their income, were septuagenarians and octogenarians who went to camp sponsored by the charity as children. The second was the Santa Claus Fund. It was launched in 1906. Troubled by the hardship faced by poor families in the city, Atkinson asked Star readers to pitch in to provide 100 Christmas gifts to needy children. This past Christmas, readers donated $1.5 million to the Santa Claus Fund to provide gifts to 50,000 youngsters. Every journalist, no matter how senior, is expected to write at least 1 solicitation for each of these funds. To purists, this crosses the line between journalism and activism. It certainly violates the ethics of the press taught in journalism schools. I was never fully comfortable with the Star's dual role. I'll wrap this up with a few general thoughts about how Joseph Atkinson's legacy shaped today's Toronto Star. The Star has the reflexes of a swashbuckling giant. For most of its history, it was the biggest, boldest newspaper in the country. This state of mind helps explain why the rise of the internet in the 80s and 90s left the Star so disoriented and vulnerable. The newspaper is a magnet for talent. Its willingness to take risks and run prominent front-page headlines has always attracted writers with style and flair. Ernest Hemingway, Morley Callahan, Pierre Burton, and June Colwood all developed their voices at the Star. Finally, and most controversially, the star is still underpinned by a clear set of humanitarian values. This explicit moral framework, some would call it a political stance, leaves it open to labels such as the Bleeding Star and the Red Reich. I spent 30 years at the Star. It was never an easy newspaper to work for. But its commitment to speak for the voiceless was and remains genuine. Its determination to shine a light in dark places is undimmed. I don't want to hog the microphone, so I'll leave it there. I look forward to your questions. Ian Urquhart will come to the microphone next.
Thanks, Carol. Thank you, Haroon, for the introduction. Everybody hear me back there? It's good? No?
Louder.
Louder? Okay.
This microphone is only for the TV, so.
And thank you, Natalie, for hosting this, and Massey College for hosting this event. My topic, as Carol mentioned, is a star in the 1980s, specifically two campaigns. You could call them crusades, in which the Star and myself, as first editorial page editor and the then managing editor, were deeply involved. Also, one of our guests here today was deeply involved, David Peterson. Those two topics are the Meech Lake Accord and the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Let me take the Meech Lake Accord first. It was agreed to 35 years ago at a meeting hosted by then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The stated purpose was to win Quebec's support for the constitutional changes of the early 1980s. Amongst other things, it would have given Quebec a veto over future changes to the Constitution and recognized Quebec as a distinct society, whatever that meant. There was a remarkable consensus in the country at the time that the Meech Lake Accord was a good thing. Due to Mulroney's persuasive powers, and Mr. Peterson could tell you he was very persuasive, it had the support of all 10 premiers representing 3 different political parties. It was also supported by the 2 opposition leaders at the time, Sean Turner and Ed Broadbent. And importantly, it was editorially endorsed by almost every daily newspaper in the country. I've never seen a consensus like that on anything before or since. Every paper except the Star, that is, the country's biggest paper. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy being out there all alone on this topic. We were accused of all sorts of base motives, including being anti-Quebec, which we definitely were not, because the media focus was almost entirely on how the Accord affected Quebec. But as a newspaper, we began to look into some of the other details of the Accord, and what we found wasn't pretty. In order to win the support of the other premiers, particularly in the West, Mr. Mulroney had agreed to give them the power to, among other things, appoint senators and Supreme Court judges. Imagine, if you will, a senator or Senate appointed by the likes of Jason Kenney or Francois Legault or Doug Ford. No longer would it be a chamber of sober second thought. Rather, it would become an empowered obstacle to federal initiatives, sort of like the U.S. Senate today. And imagine, if you will, a Supreme Court appointed by Kenney and Legault and Ford. It would be highly politicized, again, sort of like the U.S. Supreme Court. As it turned out, we weren't actually alone in our opposition to the Accord. A certain Quebecer of some renown, Pierre Trudeau, shared our concerns about it. And he went public with an anti-Meech essay, which we then published on our front page. La Presse simultaneously ran a French version on its front page. Trudeau's critique landed with a thud, and the debate on Meech began to turn. Meanwhile, the provincial governments began to change, and anti-Meech premiers, notably Clyde Wells in Newfoundland and Frank McKenna in New Brunswick, began to take office. Also, a new national party emerged, Reform, under Preston Manning, with opposition to the Meech Accord at its core. We weren't entirely comfortable being on the same side as Preston Manning, but politics sometimes makes for strange bedfellows. The end result was that Meech died, although another Accord, Charlottetown, emerged from its ashes. But that's another story, and I don't want to bore you with it right now. Then came the Free Trade Agreement. There were some important differences between the debate over that agreement and Meech, including the outcome. But first, some background. Mulroney did not win an election in 1984, that big majority, on a free trade platform. Indeed, in the preceding leadership campaign, he had trashed the idea of a free trade deal with the U.S. But a year into his first term, a Royal Commission report landed on his desk. It was authored by Donald MacDonald, a senior minister in the Trudeau government. And prior to leaving office, Pierre Trudeau had appointed MacDonald to head up a commission on Canada's economic prospects. When he reported 3 years later, by then Mulroney was Prime Minister, and in his report, MacDonald recommended Canada strike a deal with the Americans. This hadn't actually been foreseen because MacDonald had been part of a government that had vigorously pursued a contractual link, fancy description for a free trade deal with Europe, because the Trudeau government wanted to offset our dependence on the U.S. market. At any rate, this is what MacDonald recommended. Mulroney eagerly accepted it as government policy, and he found a like-minded partner in the White House at the time, Ronald Reagan. There were some bumps along the road, but with the two countries' leaders firmly in favor, the deal was done. Unlike Meech, there was less of a consensus on this deal. The opposition leaders, in this case Turner and Broadbent still, were opposed. So were some of the premiers, including Mr. Peterson, now present, and other opposition politicians in the provinces, too many to mention. But the business establishment was firmly in favor of it, and so were most of the media outlets, including even the CBC. The Star at the time, for daring to criticize the deal, was trashed regularly by columnists in the Globe and not the National Post and the Sun, and commentators on the CBC. So we stood largely alone in challenging the deal and examining its details. For instance, the deal allowed the Americans to continue slapping punitive tariffs on our products for spurious reasons. And that's a loophole the Americans have used continuously since. And I'm not just talking about Trump. This weapon was first used, as you'll recall, against our softwood lumber exports back in the Clinton era. Nevertheless, Mulroney won the '88 election, another majority, which was largely fought over that deal, as the Liberals and NDP split the anti-deal vote. So it became law of the land and has remained in place for better or worse since. Why am I telling you all this? I'm sometimes asked if I regret the role of the Star and myself and your father, John, who was editorial page editor through much of this time, and then editor, played in these events. I have no regrets. I think we did the country a service by asking questions that others were not asking and exposing the weaknesses of these two deals. And I think that's what good journalism is all about, and I hope it continues, and I hope the Star remains in existence to do those questions. Thank you for your attention, and now I'm going to turn the mic over to Bob Hepburn, with whom I worked on these issues as well, but he's going to talk about subsequent fights the Star was involved in.
Thank you, Howard. And its role in Quebec, dealing with the 1995 referendum. But I thought there'd be too much criticism raising the issue of when the Star hired 10 buses to take Torontonians up to Montreal for a big love-in, which we wound up in a lot of controversy with the Quebec government. Even La Presse, who was sort of on our side, didn't like the idea at all. I'm going to talk about the Star and city building. I'm also going to talk about the Star today. As you know, we were sold almost 2 years ago, and I dare, with our vice chair sitting here, I want to talk about how the paper has changed or has not changed. Anyway, let me first talk about city building. From 1990 to 2010, the Star launched 2 campaigns. In those days, we called them crusades. First was focused on Toronto, and the second was focused on big cities across Canada. The first campaign centered on the patchwork quilt of inward-looking local governments, competing transit systems, and affordable housing deficits that constituted Greater Toronto. The Star saw a need to unite the GTA, or at least the City of Toronto, the 416 area. So, thus it launched a multi-year campaign, Making Our City Work. It sponsored a debate with Ontario's 3 political leaders, Bob Rae, Lynn MacLeod, Mike Harris, that attracted 800 people. The Star was setting the agenda. After he was elected premier, Mike Harris announced amalgamation of Toronto, East York, Etobicoke, North York, Scarborough, and York into one megacity. Opposition was ferocious from the city's existing 6 boroughs. Non-binding referendums were held in all 6 boroughs, resulting in votes that were 3-1 against. The Star remained determined. The level of vitriol and ill feeling engendered towards the Star was constant. At every social gathering, reporters, columnists, and even editorial page editors, I dare say, were accosted, most of them in less than polite language. Harris ignored those referendum results and forged ahead, all with the full support of the Star, which deposed him in elections both before and after amalgamation. I would argue that without the full backing of the Star, the creation of the megacity might never have happened. On the national scene, the Star launched its New Deal for Cities campaign in 2002, citing the ongoing crisis of affordable housing and funding for transit and social welfare systems. It urged Canadian cities be given new powers, new respect. It argued that any New Deal must involve fundamental changes in government structures and finances. It stressed that no longer should large cities be deemed mere creatures of the province, but rather as distinct power centers with legitimate needs requiring attention. The campaign never stopped. Day after day, the Star drummed the phrase, New Deal, into the public consciousness, 1 million readers a day. Other media who initially scoffed at us, were forced to pay attention. Gradually, big cities across the countries were given new powers, allowing them to think big at times. In Ontario, the province signed into law in 2006 the City of Toronto Act, which gave it some powers to impose new taxes, such as the land transfer tax. It wasn't all that the city wanted, but it was a start. I'd argue that it's time for another New Deal for Cities campaign. That's because, for the most part, our mayors are still beggars and whiners when it comes to dealing with senior government. Look at how, in 2018, Doug Ford slashed the size of the Toronto City Council by half in the midst of an election campaign. He did it as an act of revenge against John Tory and the city. But no one, not even the courts, could stop him. And speaking about our city and Ford, I want to remind you that the Star was really the only paper that aggressively took on Rob Ford and brought him down. Our relentless unveiling of Ford made headlines around the world. The fact that these stories continued in the face of advertising and readership boycotts championed by the Ford clan, Ford Nation, costing the paper tens of thousands of dollars, only reinforced the value of our journalism. Lastly, I want to speak about the Star's role today. The sale of the paper was a moment few of us ever imagined happening. But the writing may have been on the wall for quite some time. For the past 25 years, digital transformations in how news is produced, distributed, and consumed have upended the business of journalism. Sure, a few papers, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, have attracted millions of online subscribers willing to pay for quality journalism. But many newspapers at the regional and local level across North America, across the world, have suffered acute losses or closed altogether. I remember in 2013 when John Honderich talked to me about how he was shaken to the core when the Graham family sold its interest in the Washington Post to billionaire Jeff Bezos. The Star often compared itself to the Post with its comparable family structure, corporate structure, and passion for journalism. Don Graham argued that the losses had become too great for his family. For the first time ever, the Grahams asked themselves if they felt their small public company could still operate the Post. Or was it not time to hand over to someone with both the resolve and the resources to carry on? In 2020, the families that controlled the Star reached that same conclusion. So under our new owners, what, if anything, has changed? Are we still committed to quality journalism, investigative journalism, agenda-setting journalism? We are. We're hiring new reporters. We're setting new agendas, which is best seen with our current campaign for massive improvements in long-term care facilities in Ontario and across the country. Is there an idealism at play at the Star? Yes. The Atkinson principles, which I think I can name a few of them. Carol's right. Most of the staff in the newsroom probably can't name any of them. These principles are still meaningful, though, to the staff. Our job is to keep those values. Importantly, what people still at the Star, myself included, share, as one person wrote recently, is an unbridled passion for the paper. Not just any paper, but Canada's largest and arguably most successful paper. It's the paper whose campaigns are for a kinder and fairer society have played a key role in and had a profound effect on Canadian society. We are proud of that history. Today, we remain a voice for the disadvantaged, the marginalized. That mission is as important as ever, and we take it seriously. One of the best examples of how we still play a big role in shaping agendas today is our coverage of the pandemic. Our reporting has helped reveal the degree to which our healthcare system was crumbling. We broke news that angered governments. We helped readers navigate this unprecedented health emergency as our leaders sometimes lost their way. Be assured, the journalistic drive for excellence remains intact in the Star's newsroom, and we still seek a big role for us to play. Thank you.
I'm just going to turn this over to you guys. This is going to be as good or as bad as you are. So any questions anyone has? Observations? David, do you want to pontificate?
I agree with all four. I came here to learn. I've just recently come over to the dark side, so I'm just learning about this. And the one thing I've learned is when you're in politics, and I've said this before, when politics, half the people hate you. When you're the media, 3/4 of the people hate you. So, and everybody's got an opinion. It's like politics. Everybody has an opinion, and they feel free to share it with you. Bob articulated, I think, the situation very well with the new ownership. I was dragged into this late. The two new owners are John Biddove and Paul Rivette. Both people I know extremely well now. I knew them reasonably well then. And they brought me in as the liberal beard. I was the protector of the Atkinson principles, and I didn't know what they were. But when you say you don't know, and you're right, Carol, but actually everybody knows, because it's the voice for the voiceless. It is speaking up anytime you see an injustice. And everybody at the Star understands that, even if they can't name all the principles. And I think everybody's very, very proud to be part of that, just like I'm very proud to be part of that today. And I've gotten to know these, Paul and Jordan very well, and they're enormously decent people. There was a fear, and because I knew Robin's dad very well, and I think John got a little bit of comfort that I was part of the group, that we wouldn't jettison the thing. And there was the principle. The sense was, are these guys a bunch of crypto Nazis who are going to turn this into another right-wing paper? Because they weren't well known, and if they'd been identified with anything, it was more the conservative party. They weren't active. But like most rich people, they're conservatives, right? Or they tacitly were. But they've taken on this mission with great passion. And they stuck their names out front on the fights, and Bob talked about them, with long-term care. And they've taken abuse from their friends, and I hear about it all of the time. When they took on the developers at the 413 highway, you wouldn't believe the phone calls we all got. It's not easy. It's tougher than politics in a whole bunch of ways, because these guys can threaten you with money and cut off advertising, and they can bring real pressure to bear. And every single thing I've seen is the principles of that paper are terribly intact, and people are very, very proud to represent what B. Hendrick and John Honderich and the Hendrick family and the 5 families and Joe Atkinson represented. And it's certainly in my wheelhouse as a, shall we say, liberal politician, from a failed liberal politician, coming back in a different way. So having joined the dark side, I'm having more fun than I've ever had.
Oh, good.
Now, just one of the things since I got the microphone, to hell with you. This is the biggest crowd I've had in 4 years. But this is an extremely tough business. The newspaper business is going like this. The information business is not going like that. And the question is, how do we become part of the information business? How do we keep the quality? Because as Bob said, this is all the digitization. The Star was slow into this. That's one of the problems they had. And now we are trying to make up for lost ground. We've stopped the erosion on the subscription side, and there's nobody better in the world than John Honderich at figuring this all out. And he's an authority. He could talk on this, on how to measure our impact and how to understand the new readership and where the new readership is going. Enormous investments are being made in quality. There's no cutbacks. We're not cutting our way to financial success here. We are growing our way to financial success. And there's other assets at the Torstar Group. And but don't get the impression this is easy. This is hard. It's as hard as anything. In some ways, it's a buggy whip's business, the newspaper business. But we're fighting back hard, and so far, enormous success. And we've had great loyalty from the staff and the traditional Star types who are, I don't know anybody at the Star wasn't proud to be there. And they're still proud to be there, and we're going to try to keep them proud to be there. So anyway, I didn't come here to speak. I can't even but unless you want me to keep going.
Until that day comes, David, your job is to keep writing checks. Please.
Can I join you because I'm very small? This is the mic for.
Yes, please come.
Otherwise, I have to have my back to
Sure,
something,
okay.
right? So, I'll just
Come.
try if I may. Stand still. You're very important. You make this thing
Please
happen.
come.
Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Je crois que Nathalie est partie, but I would like to thank David Peterson for standing up and saying all those nice things. I'm here not to speak about the Star so much, although I worked for the Star in the 80s. I want to just speak for a few minutes about John Honderich, because I thought that's what this was all about. I was born into an important newspaper. You can't hear me.
Use the microphone.
Is it on?
That microphone.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll shout. I was born, like John Honderich, into an important newspaper family. I'm the fourth generation of William Southam, whose scholarships, fellowships, and so on are right here based in Massey. And the reason I want to talk about John is that I knew his parents. My late husband and I entertained B. Honderich, and young man, I haven't met you, Robin, but I'm very glad to see you. Hope to speak to you later. When the Quebec referendum hit in 1995, most politicians that I knew didn't know what to do about it. I went to my friends in the Liberal Party in Ottawa. They were shocked and horrified but didn't know what to do. I went to Mike Harris, he couldn't have cared less. I went to Barbara Hall, and I went to John Honderich. I got support from both to start an organization called French for the Future. That organization is now 25 years old. And guess what? John Honderich gave me promotional publication on the front page of the Star the first day of my event at City Hall. He gave me a follow-up the second day and a follow-up the third day, all because of a journalist called Patricia Orwin. Do any of you Star people here know or remember her?
Yes.
Yes.
Very much so.
Well, I just wanted to say that if I hadn't had Barbara Hall, John Ralston Saul, $15,000 from the Royal Bank, and the help of the Toronto Star, this little organization of mine, French for the Future, would not have got going. It would not have lasted. So the Star is special in my memory. Your father and your grandfather are important to me still. So thank you all for letting me just say this about John, because this is a personal thank you. It's my personal testimony in his memory. Thank you very much.
Very nice.
Thank you, Haroon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing it. Any questions? Tom, you want to ask any question? Tom is a neighbor of mine, and he's a former city planner who had very strong views about the amalgamation. Any questions, anybody? If not, let me just introduce two people or three people who are from the Star who are brilliant in their own right. Mike Peary sitting here is a former foreign editor, and then later on worked with John Honderich in producing the history of the Toronto Star. He held my hand by telex and telephone when I was covering the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, one of the best editors that the Star ever had. Tim Harper here, this handsome young man, he has been a former national affairs columnist, correspondent in Washington, and then became a columnist one more time. And at the back there is Jim Rankin. And Jim Rankin is the ace police reporter who single-handedly, almost single-handedly, had waged this campaign against police brutality and police racism against black people. And more than any other Canadian has almost ended police carding, at least on paper, in this country. And next to him is Kathy English. She was the ombudsperson for the Toronto Star for the longest time, holding us to high ethics and so on. She has retired, and now she is the chairperson of the Canadian Journalism Foundation. Any questions? Beeman, we are all so good, you have no questions?
Well, look, I'll ask a question.
Yeah, please.
Given the events elsewhere in the world right now, I think people would like to hear, your thoughts on the situation in Ukraine and where it's headed.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, me?
Call them about it.
Yes. No, when I was just thinking in the last 4 or 5 days, in 1991, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, the Toronto Star was the first newspaper in the Western world, if memory serves right, to advocate for the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine and all the other associated republics of the Soviet Union. At that time, it was thought to be a grand idealism, but we were doing it because we were familiar with the Ukrainian people. We have this Canadian thing about this Canada is made up of people who have fled oppression and have come here, and their country is being now has a chance to become independent. So we were the first newspaper to do so, that's one. And then the same thing happened at the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. As far as I remember, Toronto Star was the first newspaper in the Western world to call for the independence and sovereignty of Slovenia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, and so on. And all of that did not come from some Wilsonian idealism of nations, but a sense from the Canadian communities themselves, how strongly they felt. They had fled those oppressions, come to Canada, and now they find that their own nations were being either clobbered or not being allowed to become independent. So that was the role that came to us instinctively. Lately, what is happening, as I said in my column, it's just the most atrocious thing that has happened since the Second World War, which everyone agrees with. But we really are paying the price for the last 20 or 30 years. That is the simple fact of it. Mr. Putin has calculated that the United States is not going to react. Even when Defense Minister Madam Anand says we have 420 or 4,200, whatever Canadian troops are going to be available, they're not available to serve in Ukraine. They're available to be able to send to NATO nations so that he does not invade NATO nations. So, in effect, poor Ukraine and Ukrainians have been left to their own wits to tackle this great invasion. But that is the price you pay for the policy of do as I say, not what I do. What Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine, this is exactly what George W. Bush did in Iraq. This is what they exactly did in Afghanistan, even though in the beginning there was a raison d'etre for going there. But that goal was accomplished within about a month. The Taliban were toppled, and then since then, they've been hammering this nation for 20 years, How many people have died? I quoted some figures in the paper. 35,000 civilians, 40,000 civilians, nobody quite knows. 200,000 civilians dead in Iraq. And then it was it didn't really matter. They're all Muslims or they're not white people, you know. And eventually it comes to bite you. That's what has happened. So if you're lecturing Mr. Putin, just look back what you did yourself. And I can tell you, I mean, in North America, we feel differently. All you have to do is travel Europe or just go beyond Europe to Asia, anywhere. And nobody believes a word of what the Americans say anymore. That's the greatest tragedy of the modern times. And I've seen that from the Middle East, Asia, India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, right to the Far East. The American word doesn't count for anything. So all the posturing that is being done by Mr. Biden, by our own Prime Minister and so on, should be done, has to be done, but it really carries no moral weight in the world. That's the tragedy of it. Unless there are more questions, this meeting is adjourned. Feel free to talk to our friends here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.